The pack banished her for saving a lost pup until they learned he was the Alpha King's son. The scream came first, then the smell of blood on the wind, and Lyra Voss was already running before her mind caught up with her feet. She had been gathering firewood near the borderline, the place where Thornridge land ended and the dead pines began, when she heard something small crying out in pain. Not a wolf's howl, a pup's cry, thin and desperate, the kind of sound that made every bone in her body move without asking permission. She found him under a fallen tree, one back leg pinned beneath a branch, his fur matted with mud and frost. He could not have been more than a few weeks old, too young to be alone, too young to survive a night in that cold without help. His eyes were wide and glassy with fear when he saw her, and for a moment he tried to snap at her fingers, some instinct telling him that every stranger was a threat. Lyra did not think about the law. She did not think about the boundary line or what it meant to cross it. She only thought about the small heartbeat she could feel racing under her palm as she lifted the branch and pulled him free. His fur carried a scent she did not recognize. Not Thornridge, not any pack she had grown up around. Something foreign, something that made the hair on her arms rise, but by then it was too late to leave him. She wrapped him in her cloak and carried him back toward the packlands, telling herself that whatever trouble this brought, she could face it later. She could not have been more wrong about how fast later would arrive. The moment she stepped past the tree line, 3 scouts were already waiting, their noses lifted, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Gareth, took one breath of the air near her, and his expression changed from confusion to alarm. "Outsider blood," he said, his voice low and sharp. "She's carrying outsider blood across the line." Lyra held the pup tighter against her chest. "He's a baby. He was trapped under a tree. I couldn't leave him there to die." "That's not your call to make," Gareth said, already turning to signal the others. Word moved through Thornridge faster than fire through dry grass. By the time Lyra reached the central lodge, a crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disgust. She scanned the crowd for anyone who might speak up for her, anyone who had ever called her a friend, but the faces only looked away or hardened further. That was the truth of her life in Thornridge. She had never been anyone's first thought. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack's rigid order, someone tolerated but never valued. She swept floors, carried water, took the tasks no one else wanted, and in return she was given a bed in the smallest hut on the edge of camp and little else. No one had ever fought for her. She had learned a long time ago not to expect that they would start now. Alpha Dorian Voss stepped out from the lodge, his presence enough to silence the crowd instantly. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes the color of iron, a man who had ruled Thornridge for over 20 years through strength and unbending law. He looked at Lyra, then at the bundle in her arms, and his jaw tightened. "Show me," he said. Lyra pulled back the edge of her cloak. The pup blinked up at the crowd, small and shivering, utterly unaware of the storm his presence had caused. Dorian leaned down and inhaled once, his expression shifting into something unreadable. "This is not Thornridge blood," he said. "This scent belongs to no pack I know, which makes it more dangerous, not less. You crossed the boundary line to bring foreign blood into our home." "I found him dying," Lyra said, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "He was trapped. He would have frozen by morning." "Then he should have frozen," said a voice from the crowd. It was Nora, one of the pack council members, a woman who had disliked Lyra since she was a child. "We do not risk everything we've built for a stray." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Lyra felt the ground shifting beneath her, felt the weight of every eye turning against her at once. She had known this pack her whole life, had grown up believing that even at the bottom of its order, she still belonged to something. In that moment, she understood how easily that belief could be erased. Dorian raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent again. "The law is clear. No outsider crosses the boundary. No exceptions, no matter the excuse." He looked at Lyra with something that might have been regret, buried deep beneath the authority in his voice. "You broke that law knowingly." "I broke it to save a life," Lyra said. "If that's a crime, then punish me for it. But do not punish him. He's done nothing." "He is the crime," Dorian said simply. "His blood is the danger." The council convened for less time than it took Lyra's hands to stop shaking. When Dorian returned, his verdict was already carved into his face before he spoke it aloud. "Lyra Voss, you are banished from Thornridge territory. Effective immediately, you will take the outsider pup with you, since you have chosen his life over your place among us. You are not to return." The words landed like physical blows, one after another, and yet Lyra found she was not entirely surprised. Some small, tired part of her had expected this outcome the moment she lifted the branch off the pup's leg. She had made her choice already, in the woods, before anyone in Thornridge ever had the chance to make it for her. She did not beg, she did not argue further. She simply nodded once, tightened her grip on the shivering pup, and turned toward the boundary line without looking back at the crowd that had once been her home. Gareth walked beside her as far as the border, not out of kindness but out of duty, making certain she left without incident. At the very edge of the tree line, he paused. "You could have just left him," he said quietly. "No one would have known." "I would have known," Lyra answered, and kept walking. The forest beyond Thornridge was called the Dead Pines for a reason. Twisted trees stood close together, blocking out most of the daylight, and the air carried a stillness that felt less like peace and more like warning. Packs that lived beyond the Dead Pines were said to be wild and lawless, territories with no clear ruler, places where a lone wolf and an unclaimed pup would be easy prey. Lyra walked until her legs ached, until the sun dropped low enough to turn the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The pup had stopped shivering against her chest, and for one heart-stopping moment she feared the worst, until she felt the small rise and fall of his breathing and nearly wept with relief. She built a fire that night in the hollow of a fallen log, using skills she had learned as a child before her parents had died and left her to the mercy of a pack that never quite wanted her. She fed the pup warm water mixed with crushed berries, the closest thing to milk she could manage, and he drank greedily, his small paws kneading against her sleeve as though searching for something familiar. "You don't know how much trouble you've caused," she murmured to him, though there was no real anger in her voice. "You don't know anything at all yet." The pup blinked up at her, his eyes catching the firelight, and something about that small, trusting gaze settled a piece of the panic still rattling inside her chest. Whatever came next, whatever dangers the Dead Pines held, she was not entirely alone anymore. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, a branch snapped. Lyra went still, every instinct sharpening at once. She pulled the pup closer and reached for the knife at her belt, the only weapon Thornridge had allowed her to keep. The forest around her had gone silent in the particular way it did when something larger than a rabbit was moving through it. Eyes caught the firelight from between two trees, low and watchful, gone the instant she turned toward them. She held her breath, waiting, but nothing emerged from the shadows. Whatever it was not ready to show itself yet. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the log, the pup curled against her side, and watched the tree line until the sky finally began to lighten with the gray edge of morning. Whatever had been watching her in the dark was gone by the time the sun rose, but the feeling of being observed did not leave with it. Thornridge had cast her out for saving a life it deemed worthless. She did not yet know that the truth was the opposite of everything the pack had believed, that the small creature sleeping against her side was worth more than every wolf in Thornridge combined. She only knew that she had made her choice, and that whatever came next, she would face it with the one small life she had refused to abandon. The Dead Pines stretched on for miles in every direction, dark and unknown, and somewhere within them, something had already begun tracking her steps. 3 days passed before Lyra allowed herself to believe that whatever had watched her that first night meant her no immediate harm. She had moved camp twice since then, each time deeper into the forest, each time more careful about the fires she lit and the tracks she left behind. She had grown up hearing stories about the dead pines, about lone wolves who wandered in and never wandered out, but she had also grown up believing Thornridge would always be her home, and that belief had already proven false once. The pup grew stronger each day. His leg healed faster than she expected, and within a week he was already trying to stand on wobbly paws, tumbling over himself in a way that would have made her laugh if laughter had come easily to her anymore. She named him Wick, because he reminded her of a candle flame flickering against the wind, small but somehow refusing to go out, no matter how hard the world blew against him. "You're a stubborn little thing," she told him one evening, watching him chase a fallen leaf across the dirt with far more energy than his tiny body should have held. "I suppose we have that much in common." Survival in the dead pines demanded more of her than Thornridge ever had. There, she had been given scraps and shelter in exchange for labor no one else wanted. Here, she had to earn every meal with her own hands, had to learn which berries were safe and which would make her sick, had to teach herself to read the forest in ways she never needed to before. She caught fish from a narrow stream using a sharpened stick, learned to set simple snares for rabbits, and slowly built a shelter of woven branches and packed mud that kept the worst of the cold wind away from where Wick slept. It was hard, and it was lonely, but there was something almost freeing in it too. In Thornridge, she had been invisible, tolerated but never truly seen. Out here, every choice she made mattered, every skill she built kept them both alive, and for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she felt like she had some measure of control over her own life. That sense of control cracked the day the wolves came back. She had gone to check her snares near a narrow ravine, leaving Wick tucked safely inside their shelter, when she caught the scent again. The same unfamiliar smell that had clung to Wick's fur the day she found him, stronger now, closer, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. Lyra froze, her hand tightening around the small knife at her belt. She counted at least 3 distinct scents threading through the trees around her, and none of them belonged to Thornridge or any pack she recognized. Whoever these wolves were, they were well-fed, well-groomed, nothing like the desperate strays she had expected to find beyond the boundary line. She backed away slowly, moving toward the shelter where Wick slept, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run. But running would only draw attention, would only confirm that she had something worth chasing. So instead she walked, steady and calm on the outside, even as her heart pounded loud enough that she feared the wolves might hear it. She made it back to the shelter without incident, scooped Wick into her arms before he had even fully woken, and moved them both to a denser part of the forest, where the trees grew close enough to block most lines of sight. She spent the rest of that day in near silence, listening for every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, but the scent did not return, and by nightfall she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. It did not stay away for long. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself. She would catch the scent, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to raise the hair on the back of her neck, and each time the wolves would vanish before she ever saw a face among the trees. She began to notice small things too. A patch of grass pressed down in a shape too deliberate to be a resting animal. A trail of prints circling her camp at a careful distance, never approaching, never retreating far either. Someone, or something, was studying her, patient in a way that unsettled her more than an outright attack would have. "They're not hunting us," she said to Wick one night, more to hear the thought spoken aloud than because she expected an answer. "If they wanted us dead, we would already be dead. They're waiting for something." Wick, now old enough to yip in response to the sound of her voice, tilted his head at her as though he understood every word. There were moments, watching him, when Lyra felt a strange unease she could not quite name. He did not behave like an ordinary pup. He watched the forest with a kind of alertness that seemed too sharp for his age, and sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, she caught him staring in the exact direction the mysterious scouts had come from the night before, as though some part of him already knew they were out there. She told herself it was nothing. Pups were curious creatures, drawn to sound and movement the way any young animal would be, but the thought lingered, a small splinter of doubt she could not fully remove. One evening, gathering wood near the edge of a shallow gorge, she found something that confirmed her fears were not imagined. Pressed into the soft mud near the water's edge was a paw print, far larger than any wolf she had ever seen in Thornridge, larger even than Alpha Dorian's, whose size had always been spoken of with a kind of hushed respect back home. Whoever, whatever, had left that print was massive, powerful, and clearly capable of moving through the forest without making a single sound she could detect. Lyra knelt beside the print, running her fingers along its edge, and felt a cold certainty settle into her chest. Whatever pack these wolves belonged to, it was not some small, desperate group scraping by on the margins of the dead pines. It was something far larger, far more organized, and far more dangerous than anything she had faced within Thornridge's boundaries. She hurried back to camp that night with a new urgency, gathering what few supplies she had and preparing to move again, deeper into the forest where she hoped the trees grew thick enough to hide them both. But as she worked, a low growl rumbled from somewhere behind her, close enough that she spun around with her knife already drawn. A wolf stood at the edge of her camp, larger than any she had ever seen, its fur a deep, near-black shade that seemed to swallow the surrounding shadows. Its eyes were a striking pale gold, fixed directly on Wick, who had gone completely still in her arms, no longer squirming or yipping, simply watching the massive wolf with an expression far too calm for a frightened pup. Lyra placed herself between the wolf and the child, her knife raised, despite knowing full well how little good it would do against something that size. "Stay back," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever you want, you'll have to go through me first." The wolf did not lunge. It did not snarl or bare its teeth the way she expected a predator closing on prey to behave. Instead, it lowered its massive head slightly, an almost respectful gesture, and let out a low sound that was closer to a whine than a growl. More shapes emerged from the trees around them, 5 wolves in total, each one large and clearly well cared for, their coats groomed and healthy in a way that spoke of a well-fed, well-organized pack rather than a band of desperate strays. None of them advanced. None of them showed any sign of aggression at all. Instead, one by one, they lowered their heads and dropped low to the ground in postures Lyra recognized immediately, having grown up watching pack hierarchies her entire life. They were kneeling. Lyra stood frozen, her knife still raised, utterly unable to process what she was seeing. Wolves this size, this clearly powerful, did not kneel before an unranked Omega and a pup they had no obvious reason to protect. Something about this entire situation had gone far beyond anything she understood, and the cold pit forming in her stomach told her that whatever explanation existed, it would change everything she thought she knew about the small creature she had rescued from beneath a fallen tree. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you kneeling?" None of the wolves answered, not that she expected them to in this form, but the black-furred wolf lifted its head and looked at her with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as though it understood her confusion completely and simply had no way to ease it. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, a new presence approached, and even before she saw him clearly, Lyra felt the shift in the air itself, a pressure that pressed down on her chest and made her knees want to buckle beneath her. Whoever was coming carried authority the way Alpha Dorian never had, something ancient and absolute, and every instinct in her body recognized it before her mind could catch up. A man stepped out from between the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked faintly with silver at the temples despite a face that showed no other signs of age. His eyes were the same striking pale gold as the wolf that had approached first, and the moment his gaze landed on Wick, something in his controlled expression cracked wide open. "Wick," he breathed, the single word carrying more raw emotion than Lyra had heard in her entire life within Thornridge's walls. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and Lyra instinctively tightened her grip on the pup, uncertain, wary despite every kneeling wolf around her. "Please," the man said, his voice rough, his golden eyes never leaving the small pup in her arms. That child is my son. I have been searching for him for weeks." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at Wick, who was no longer trembling or hiding, but instead reaching one small paw toward the man, with something like recognition in his young eyes. "Your son," she repeated slowly, the weight of the words settling over her like a physical thing. "He's not an outsider stray. He is the heir to Emberfall," the man said, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers, filled with a gratitude so intense it nearly staggered her. "And you saved his life." The forest around them fell utterly silent, as though even the wind itself had paused to absorb the weight of what had just been revealed, and Lyra Voss, banished Omega of Thornridge, stood at the center of a truth far larger than anything the pack that cast her out could ever have imagined. "My name is Ronan," the man said, once he had gathered enough composure to speak beyond his son's name. "I lead the Emberfall pack. 5 weeks ago, Wick was stolen from his cradle by wolves working for a rival faction within our own territory. Wolves who hoped that a war between packs would weaken us enough to seize power for themselves. We have searched every corner of these lands since, fearing the worst each day that passed." Lyra looked down at the pup in her arms, who was now nuzzling contentedly against her sleeve, entirely unbothered by the enormous revelation unfolding around him. "He never told me any of that," she said, the absurdity of the statement striking her even as she spoke it. "Obviously, he's a baby." A faint, tired smile crossed Ronan's face, the first sign of anything other than raw emotion since he had emerged from the trees. "No, he would not have been able to tell you anything at all, but you found him regardless, and you kept him alive when an entire kingdom could not." "I found him because I couldn't leave a helpless creature to die in the cold," Lyra said. "I didn't know what he was. I still don't understand what any of this means for me." Ronan studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes sharp and assessing in a way that made her feel as though he were reading far more from her than her words alone conveyed. "It means Thornridge cast out the one wolf brave enough to do what an entire kingdom's search parties failed to accomplish," he said finally. "It means you protected the heir of Emberfall while your own pack condemned you for it. That is not a small thing, and I do not intend to treat it as one." Before Lyra could respond, Wick let out an insistent yip, squirming in her arms until she finally allowed him to be passed toward his father's waiting hands. The moment Ronan held him, something in the massive man's shoulders eased, a tension she had not fully noticed until it visibly drained away. He pressed his face gently against the pup's fur and breathed him in as though committing the scent to memory all over again, terrified of ever losing it. "Come with us," Ronan said, once he had regained his voice. "You cannot remain out here alone, not with rival factions still active and searching. Emberfall will offer you shelter, and you will be treated as the honored guest you deserve to be." Lyra hesitated. Everything about the offer felt too large, too sudden, a complete reversal of the life she had known only weeks earlier, where she had been nothing more than an unwanted Omega scraping by on the edges of her own pack's mercy. "I don't know your territory," she said carefully. "I don't know your customs, your people, anything about your pack at all." "Then let us show you," Ronan said simply. "You have already shown Emberfall more kindness than most wolves born within our borders ever have." The journey to Emberfall took 2 full days, traveling through parts of the forest Lyra had never dared explore on her own, guided by wolves who moved with practiced efficiency and quiet respect toward both her and the pup now secure in his father's arms. As they walked, she began to understand just how vast Emberfall's territory truly was compared to the modest boundaries of Thornridge. Where her old pack had claimed a stretch of forest bordered by rival lands on nearly every side, Emberfall stretched across valleys and ridgelines that seemed to have no end, dotted with villages and outposts that spoke of a population far larger and far more prosperous than anything she had grown up around. When they finally crested a ridge overlooking Emberfall's central settlement, Lyra stopped walking entirely, momentarily overwhelmed by the sight below. Stone lodges and wooden halls spread across the valley floor, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys, the distant sound of voices and activity carrying up toward them on the wind. It looked less like a pack camp and more like a small kingdom, which she supposed was closer to the truth than she had initially understood. "This is Emberfall," Ronan said, watching her reaction with something like quiet pride. "It has stood for over 100 years, built by wolves who believed that strength and compassion were not opposing forces, but partners." Lyra said nothing, too overwhelmed to form a coherent response, and simply allowed herself to be led down into the valley, toward a life she could never have imagined only days earlier. The moment they entered the settlement, word of Wick's return spread through the crowd like wildfire through dry brush. Wolves emerged from every direction, some weeping openly with relief, others simply staring in stunned disbelief at the sight of their stolen prince alive and well in his father's arms. Lyra found herself the subject of curious, grateful stares as the crowd realized who had carried him safely through weeks in the wild, and the attention made her deeply uncomfortable in a way she had not expected. She was used to being overlooked, not celebrated, and the shift felt almost as disorienting as the banishment itself had been. Ronan led her toward the central hall, a large stone structure at the heart of the settlement, where an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair waited at the entrance. The woman's composed expression broke the moment she saw Wick, and she rushed forward to embrace both father and son with a fierce, protective urgency that told Lyra exactly who she must be. "This is Diane," Ronan explained once the woman had finally released them both. "She has served as Emberfall's healer and closest advisor since before I was born. She helped raise me, and she has been beside herself with worry since the day Wick disappeared." Diane turned her sharp gaze toward Lyra, studying her with an intensity that made Lyra want to shrink back, though she forced herself to stand still and meet the woman's eyes directly. "So you are the one," Diane said slowly, "the one who found him." "I only did what anyone should have done," Lyra said. "No," Diane said firmly, shaking her head. "You did what almost no one would have done, considering the risk. Word has already reached us of what your own pack did in response. Banished, I hear, for the crime of saving a child's life." Lyra's jaw tightened at the reminder, old wounds still too fresh to discuss comfortably in front of strangers, however kind their intentions seemed. "Thornridge had its reasons," she said quietly, though even she did not fully believe the excuse as she spoke it. "Thornridge had cowardice and short-sightedness," Diane corrected, her tone sharpening. "There is a difference, and I will not pretend otherwise, simply to spare your former pack's reputation." Ronan placed a gentle hand on Diane's shoulder, a silent request for restraint, though his own expression suggested he agreed entirely with her assessment. "Regardless of what led us here," he said, turning back to Lyra, "you are welcome within Emberfall for as long as you wish to stay. You will want for nothing, and you will answer to no one who does not treat you with the respect you have earned." Over the following days, Lyra slowly began to adjust to a life unlike anything she had known before. She was given a private room within the central hall, far larger and more comfortable than the small hut she had occupied for years back in Thornridge. She was invited to meals with pack elders who asked genuine questions about her thoughts and opinions, rather than simply directing tasks at her the way Thornridge's council always had. Wick, meanwhile, refused to be more than a few steps away from her whenever possible, trailing after her through the halls with the same stubborn devotion he had shown from the very beginning. "He trusts you completely," Ronan observed one evening, watching his son attempt to climb into Lyra's lap during a quiet gathering in the central hall. "Even now, surrounded by his own kind, he still seeks you out before anyone else." "I was the only face he knew for weeks," Lyra said, though she could not deny the warmth that spread through her chest at the observation. "It will fade, I imagine, now that he has his family back." "Perhaps," Ronan said, though something in his tone suggested he doubted that outcome entirely. "Or perhaps he recognizes something the rest of us have already come to understand." Lyra glanced up at him, uncertain what to make of the comment, but before she could ask, a commotion at the hall's entrance drew both their attention. A group of scouts entered, breathless and urgent, carrying news that immediately shifted the mood of the entire gathering. "Alpha," one of them said, addressing Ronan directly, "we've received word from the southern border. Thornridge envoys have arrived, requesting an audience." The hall fell silent, every eye turning first toward the scout, then toward Lyra, whose stomach had dropped at the mere mention of her former pack's name. Ronan's expression hardened into something cold and controlled, a stark contrast to the warmth he had shown since the moment his son had been returned to him. "After everything they did," Diane said, her voice tight with barely restrained anger, "they have the audacity to send envoys now." "They likely fear retaliation," Ronan said, his golden eyes narrowing. "Word of Wick's rescue and Lyra's banishment has surely reached every pack within 100 miles by now. Thornridge understands exactly how vulnerable their actions have left them." Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the hall settle on her once more, and she straightened her spine despite the unease coiling in her chest. Whatever came next, whatever Thornridge hoped to gain by sending envoys into Emberfall's territory, she refused to shrink away from it the way her old pack had always expected her to. "What will you do?" she asked Ronan directly. "I will hear what they have to say," Ronan said, his voice measured despite the anger still simmering beneath it. "And then I will decide how Emberfall responds to a pack that threw away the one wolf who did right by my son, simply because they were too afraid to break their own rigid rules." The envoys were brought before the central hall the following morning, 3 representatives from Thornridge that Lyra recognized immediately, including Nora, the council member who had spoken loudest against her during the banishment. Their expressions shifted from careful diplomacy to visible alarm the moment they spotted Lyra seated near Ronan's side, clearly not having expected to find her so thoroughly integrated into Emberfall's inner circle. "Alpha King Ronan," Nora began, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension radiating from her posture. "Thornridge sends its deepest apologies for any distress caused by recent events. We were unaware of the child's true identity when the unfortunate incident occurred." "Unfortunate incident," Ronan repeated, his tone flat and dangerous. "Is that what you call banishing a wolf for saving my son's life?" Nora's composure faltered slightly. "Our laws exist to protect our pack from outside threats. Lyra Voss broke those laws, regardless of her intentions. Her intentions saved a child's life that your entire pack's rigid laws would have let freeze to death beneath a fallen tree," Ronan said, his voice rising slightly for the first time since Lyra had met him. "Tell me, councilwoman, does Thornridge value its rules more than the lives they claim to protect?" The hall fell into tense silence, and Lyra watched Nora's face pale as she struggled to find an adequate response. For the first time since her banishment, Lyra felt something shift inside her chest, a small flicker of vindication rising to replace the shame Thornridge had tried so hard to instill in her. "We ask only for peace between our territories," Nora said finally, her voice quieter now. "Whatever punishment you feel is warranted for our council's decision, we ask that it not extend to war between our packs." Ronan's gaze flicked briefly toward Lyra, something unreadable passing between them before he turned his attention back to the envoys. "Peace is not out of reach," he said slowly, "but it will come with conditions, and those conditions begin with an acknowledgement of exactly what your pack lost the day you cast this woman out." Lyra sat quietly amid the tension filling the hall, aware that whatever came next would reshape not only the fragile peace between 2 powerful packs, but also the entire course of the life she had once believed was over the moment Dorian Voss spoke the word banished. The Thornridge envoys left Emberfall 3 days later, having agreed to terms that Ronan dictated with an authority Lyra suspected few dared to challenge. Thornridge would formally recognize her rescue of Wick as an act of honor rather than treason, striking her banishment from their records entirely, though Lyra found she cared little for the formal reversal itself. What mattered more was the quiet satisfaction of watching Nora leave Emberfall's hall with far less pride than she had arrived with. Yet even as the immediate threat of conflict between the 2 packs eased, a different kind of tension began building within Lyra, one she found far harder to manage than any council decision or political negotiation. Life within Emberfall continued to shift in ways she had never anticipated when she first stumbled into the settlement, carrying nothing but a rescued pup and the clothes on her back. She spent her mornings with Diane, learning the healing arts the older woman had practiced for decades, discovering a genuine aptitude for the work that surprised them both. She spent her afternoons with Wick, who continued to seek her out despite having his entire family and pack restored to him, curling against her side during quiet moments as though some part of him still needed the reassurance of her presence. And increasingly, she found her evenings drawn toward conversations with Ronan himself, discussions that started as simple updates on Wick's development but slowly expanded into something far more personal. "You never speak about your life before Thornridge," Ronan observed one evening, as they walked along the edge of the settlement while Wick slept soundly under Diane's watchful care. "I know almost nothing about who you were before the day you found my son." Lyra considered deflecting, as she had grown accustomed to doing whenever the topic of her past arose, but something about the quiet honesty in Ronan's tone made her want to answer truthfully instead. "My parents died when I was young," she said simply. "An illness swept through Thornridge one winter, and I was the only one in my family who survived it. I was raised by the pack after that, though raised is perhaps too generous a word. I was tolerated, fed enough to survive, given enough shelter to avoid the worst of the cold, but never truly welcomed." Ronan's expression darkened slightly at the admission, though he said nothing, allowing her space to continue if she chose. "An Omega without family holds little value in a pack like Thornridge," Lyra continued. "I understood that from a young age. I stopped expecting kindness a long time ago, which made it easier to accept when the pack finally decided I was no longer worth keeping around at all." "That should never have been your reality," Ronan said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of genuine anger on her behalf rather than pity, which she found she appreciated far more than sympathy would have. "No wolf should be made to feel disposable simply because they lack the right bloodline or rank. It made me strong enough to survive the dead pines," Lyra said, offering a faint attempt at humor to ease the heaviness of the conversation. "I suppose Thornridge inadvertently prepared me for exactly the situation they threw me into." Ronan did not laugh, though a faint, warm smile crossed his face regardless. "You are remarkable, Lyra Voss. I hope you understand that, regardless of what Thornridge ever made you believe about your own worth." The words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, the kind of genuine acknowledgement she had spent her entire life without ever receiving. She found herself unable to respond immediately, caught between the instinct to deflect the compliment and a growing desire to simply accept it for once. Their conversations continued in this manner over the following weeks, each one peeling back another layer of the careful walls Lyra had built around herself over years of learning not to trust kindness when it appeared. She began to notice small things about Ronan she had not paid attention to before. The way his expression softened whenever Wick was nearby, the quiet patience he showed with pack members who came to him with grievances, the way his golden eyes seemed to find her across a crowded room even when he had no obvious reason to be searching for her at all. She told herself these observations meant nothing, that she was simply adjusting to a life where someone finally treated her with basic decency, but the flutter in her chest whenever their eyes met suggested otherwise. Diane noticed long before Lyra was willing to admit anything to herself. "You watch him the way he watches you," the older woman said one afternoon as they ground herbs together in the small healing hut at the edge of the settlement. "I have known Ronan since before he could walk, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Lyra nearly dropped the mortar in her hands, heat rushing to her face. "That's not, he's grateful, that's all. Any parent would feel gratitude toward the person who saved their child. Gratitude does not linger the way I have seen him linger," Diane said, unconvinced. "Gratitude does not find excuses to walk beside someone every evening, or seek their opinion on matters that have nothing to do with the child they saved." Lyra had no response for that, mostly because some part of her had already begun to suspect the same thing, though she had refused to let the thought fully form until Diane spoke it aloud. The idea terrified her in ways she struggled to articulate. a fear rooted not in Ronan himself, but in the years of learning that wanting something, wanting to belong somewhere, only ever led to deeper disappointment when it was inevitably taken away. That fear crystallized into something sharper one evening when a messenger arrived from the eastern border, bearing news that shattered the fragile peace Emberfall had only just begun to settle into. A group calling themselves the Ashclaw, remnants of the same faction responsible for Wick's original abduction, had regrouped near the border and were rumored to be planning a second attempt, this time aiming not just to take the prince, but to eliminate anyone standing in their way, including the woman who had thwarted their first attempt entirely by accident. "They know your name now," Ronan said grimly, once the messenger's report had been fully relayed to the pack's inner circle. "Word of your rescue spread far beyond Thornridge's borders, and the Ashclaw sees you as an obstacle they failed to account for the first time." Lyra felt a cold weight settle in her stomach, not entirely for her own safety, but for the fear that her presence within Emberfall had now placed the entire pack, and Wick especially, at greater risk than before. "Perhaps I should leave," she said quietly, the words tasting bitter even as she spoke them. "If my presence here draws further danger, I don't want to be the reason harm comes to any of you." The reaction to her suggestion was immediate and unanimous. Diane's expression hardened into open disapproval. Several pack elders seated nearby shook their heads firmly. And Ronan, more than anyone else in the room, looked at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "You will not leave," he said, his voice low but absolute. "Whatever threat the Ashclaw poses, running from Emberfall will not make you safer. It will only make you an easier target, alone and unprotected in the wilds once again. But if they're targeting me specifically, then Emberfall will protect you the same way it protects every member of this pack," Ronan interrupted firmly. "You are not separate from us, Lyra. Not anymore." The declaration hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared to address directly in front of the gathered elders, though the meaning beneath the words was unmistakable to everyone present. Lyra felt her chest tighten with an emotion she had spent years refusing to allow herself, a fragile, terrifying hope that perhaps she had finally found a place where she was wanted, not out of obligation or gratitude alone, but because someone genuinely valued her presence in their life. Later that evening, once the gathering had dispersed, and the immediate panic over the Ashclaw's movements had settled into careful, deliberate planning for the pack's defense, Ronan found her sitting alone near the edge of the settlement, watching the stars begin to emerge over the valley. "You are afraid," he said, settling beside her without invitation, though she found she did not mind his presence at all. "I've spent my whole life being told I don't belong anywhere," Lyra admitted quietly. "It's easier to expect that to remain true than to hope for something different, only to lose it later." "You belong here," Ronan said simply. "Not because of what you did for Wick, though that alone would be reason enough for any pack to welcome you. You belong here because Emberfall is stronger, kinder, and more complete with you in it. I have felt that truth grow clearer every single day since you arrived." Lyra turned to look at him fully, searching his expression for any hint of exaggeration or empty comfort, but found only quiet sincerity staring back at her. "Thornridge spent years convincing me I was worth nothing," she said softly. "It's difficult to unlearn that in a matter of weeks." "Then let Emberfall spend as long as it takes teaching you otherwise," Ronan said, reaching over to gently take her hand in his own, a small gesture that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "I am not offering you gratitude, Lyra. I am offering you a place here, permanently, as more than a guest, and more than someone I owe a debt to." Lyra's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words settling over her like the first true warmth she had felt in years. She did not answer immediately, uncertain her voice would hold steady if she tried, but she did not pull her hand away either, and in the quiet stillness of the evening, that alone felt like an answer of its own. Somewhere beyond Emberfall's borders, the Ashclaw continued their preparations, unaware that the woman they intended to eliminate had already found something within Emberfall's walls worth fighting to protect far more fiercely than she had ever fought for herself. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Ronan had taken her hand beneath the stars, when the eastern watchtowers erupted into a chorus of warning howls that tore Lyra from sleep, with her heart already hammering against her ribs. She was on her feet and moving before she had fully processed the sound, years of instinct from a harder life kicking in faster than conscious thought could catch up. Wick. Her first thought was entirely for the pup, and she sprinted through the darkened halls toward the chamber where he slept, nearly colliding with Diane, who was already moving in the same direction with the same fierce urgency etched across her face. "The Ashclaw," Diane said breathlessly, not slowing her pace. "They've breached the eastern border. Ronan is already rallying the defense." Together they reached Wick's chamber and found him already awake, sitting upright in his small bed with wide, alert eyes that held none of the confusion Lyra expected from a child roused so abruptly. He looked toward her the moment she entered, and something in his expression, some flicker of understanding far beyond his age, told her that whatever was happening outside, he sensed the danger as clearly as any adult in the settlement. "We need to move him somewhere secure," Lyra said, already scooping the pup into her arms. "The healing hut has reinforced walls, doesn't it? Somewhere defensible." "This way," Diane said, leading them through a network of narrow corridors Lyra had only partially explored during her time at Emberfall, corridors clearly designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Outside, the sounds of battle had already begun in earnest, the clash of bodies and the sharp cries of wolves locked in combat, carrying across the valley, even from within the settlement's interior halls. Lyra's mind raced through everything she had learned about the Ashclaw's intentions, the messenger's warning replaying in her thoughts with sickening clarity. They wanted Wick, and now, apparently, they wanted her as well, seeing her as the unexpected obstacle that had ruined their first attempt entirely. She would not let them succeed a second time. Once Wick was secured within the reinforced healing hut, surrounded by a handful of trusted guards Diane had summoned, Lyra found herself facing an impossible pull between two competing instincts. Every part of her wanted to remain beside the pup, to protect the small life she had already risked everything for once before. But another part of her, one that had grown stronger during her weeks at Emberfall, refused to hide while the pack that had welcomed her so completely fought for its survival without her. "Stay here," Diane said, reading the conflict plainly on her face. "Wick needs someone he trusts. That is your role in this fight, Lyra, and it is no less important than standing on the front line." Lyra nodded, forcing herself to accept the wisdom in Diane's words, though every instinct still screamed at her to do more. She settled beside Wick's small form, one hand resting protectively over him, and listened to the distant sounds of battle with a helplessness that felt far worse than any physical danger she had faced in the dead pines. The fighting raged for what felt like hours, though Lyra later learned it had lasted barely half that time. Emberfall's warriors, trained and disciplined under Ronan's long years of leadership, pushed back the Ashclaw's forces with a ferocity that spoke to exactly how much the pack valued its prince and the woman who had saved him. But the Ashclaw had come prepared for a prolonged conflict, and as the morning wore on, reports trickled back to the healing hut, suggesting the battle was far from settled. It was during a lull in the fighting, when a runner arrived seeking additional bandages and supplies, that Lyra learned the second, more devastating piece of news. A separate contingent from the Ashclaw had circled around the main battle entirely, moving toward the healing hut itself under cover of the chaos, having somehow learned exactly where Wick had been secured. "How many?" Lyra demanded, already rising to her feet, every muscle in her body tensing. "At least 4, the runner said, breathless and pale. "They're moving fast. The guards posted here won't hold them for long." Lyra's mind raced through her limited options. She was no trained warrior, had never been given the chance to learn true combat within Thornridge's rigid hierarchy, but she had survived weeks alone in the dead pines with nothing but a knife and her own resourcefulness, and she refused to simply wait for danger to arrive at her doorstep. "Reinforce the door," she told the guards remaining in the hut. "Whatever happens, do not let them reach Wick." She moved to the hut's rear entrance, the one most guards had overlooked in their focus on the main approach, and positioned herself where she could intercept anyone attempting to flank the building from behind. Her heart pounded against her ribs, fear coiling tight in her stomach, but beneath that fear ran something else entirely, a fierce, unshakable resolve that had carried her through every hardship since the day Thornridge cast her out. The first attacker came through the trees moments later, a lean, scarred wolf who clearly expected an easy path into the hut's undefended rear. He froze for half a second upon spotting Lyra blocking his path, clearly not expecting resistance from an unarmed Omega, and that half-second of hesitation was exactly what she needed. She moved before he could recover, driving her knife forward with every ounce of strength weeks of hard survival had built into her arms. The wolf snarled, twisting away just enough to avoid a fatal strike, but the blade still caught his shoulder, drawing a sharp cry of pain that alerted the guards inside to the breach. 3 more attackers emerged from the shadows, and for a terrifying moment, Lyra found herself facing odds that felt impossibly stacked against her. But the guards from within the hut spilled out to join the fight, and somewhere in the chaos, a familiar dark shape crashed through the tree line with a ferocity that scattered the remaining attackers in an instant. Ronan had heard the commotion and abandoned the main battle line entirely, cutting through the forest with a speed that spoke to exactly how much urgency drove him. He fought with a brutal efficiency that left little doubt about why Emberfall's enemies feared him, dispatching 2 of the remaining attackers before they could even mount a proper defense, while the guards subdued the last one, struggling against Lyra's earlier strike. When the immediate threat had finally cleared, Ronan turned to Lyra, his golden eyes wide, with a fear that had clearly gripped him the moment he realized the healing hut was under direct attack. "You're hurt," he said, noticing the shallow cut along her forearm, where one attacker's claws had caught her during the struggle. "It's nothing," Lyra said, though her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline draining away and leaving raw nerves in its place. "Wick is safe, that's what matters." Ronan pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her tightly enough that she felt the frantic pace of his heartbeat against her own chest. "I nearly lost you," he murmured against her hair. "When I heard they'd breached this side of the settlement, I thought—" "I'm here," Lyra said softly, allowing herself the comfort of his embrace in a way she would never have permitted herself only weeks earlier. "We're both here." The main battle concluded shortly after, Emberfall's forces successfully repelling the Ashclaw's assault and capturing enough of their remaining fighters to learn the full scope of the faction's plans. It was during the interrogation of these captured fighters that a final, damning piece of information emerged, one that sent a fresh wave of anger rippling through Emberfall's council. Certain individuals within Thornridge, desperate to reclaim some measure of standing after the humiliation of their forced apology, had provided the Ashclaw with information about Emberfall's defenses in exchange for a promise that Thornridge would be spared any future retaliation once the Ashclaw seized control. It was a betrayal that went beyond simple cowardice, a calculated gamble that had nearly cost Wick his life a second time and had very nearly claimed Lyra's as well. When word of Thornridge's involvement reached Alpha Dorian, the response from the old pack was immediate and desperate. A formal delegation arrived within days, led by Dorian himself, offering full cooperation in rooting out the individuals responsible and pledging whatever restitution Emberfall demanded to preserve what remained of the fragile peace between their territories. Ronan received the delegation with a coldness Lyra had not seen from him before, though she understood the depth of betrayal that fueled it. Dorian, once so absolute and unshakable within Thornridge's hierarchy, stood before Emberfall's council with none of the authority he had wielded the day he banished her. "You once told me the law was clear," Lyra said quietly, stepping forward before Ronan could respond, unable to hold back the words any longer. No outsider crosses the boundary. No exceptions. Yet your own council found exceptions easily enough when it served their pride, betraying an entire pack's safety for the sake of avoiding embarrassment. Dorian's expression, for the first time in her memory, showed something close to genuine shame. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for a man who had spent decades never questioning his own judgment. "Wrong to banish you, and wrong to allow Thornridge to fall so far that some among us would risk allying with those who sought to harm a child. Your apology means little to me now," Lyra said, though there was no cruelty in her tone, only quiet certainty. "I no longer need Thornridge's approval to know my own worth." The delegation departed soon after, having agreed to harsh terms that would see Thornridge's influence significantly diminished for years to come, a fitting consequence for a pack that had thrown away its own integrity in pursuit of pride. Lyra watched them go, with a lightness in her chest she had not expected to feel, the final threads connecting her to a life defined by rejection, finally severed for good. That evening, as Emberfall celebrated both the defeat of the Ashclaw and the safe recovery of their prince, Ronan called the entire pack together within the central hall. Wick perched happily on his shoulders despite the chaos of the previous days already fading from the young pup's resilient memory. "Emberfall owes its continued safety, and my son's very life, to a woman this pack initially knew only as a stranger, carrying an unclaimed pup through our borders," Ronan announced, his voice carrying across the packed hall with an authority Lyra had come to associate entirely with strength, tempered by genuine compassion. "Lyra Voss did not simply save my son once, in the dead pines where any lesser wolf would have looked away. She saved him again today, standing between him and danger without hesitation, despite having every reason to protect only herself." The hall fell silent, every eye turning toward Lyra, who stood frozen at the center of attention she had spent her entire life avoiding. "I am formally naming her Wick's guardian," Ronan continued, "with full rights and responsibilities within Emberfall's council. But that alone does not represent the full truth of what she means to this pack, or to me personally." He crossed the distance between them, taking her hand in front of the entire gathered pack, his golden eyes holding hers with a certainty that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "Lyra Voss, you arrived at Emberfall as an exile, cast out by a pack too rigid and too proud to recognize the value of what you offered them. I do not intend to make the same mistake. Before this pack, before my son, and before every wolf who calls Emberfall home, I claim you as my mate, not out of gratitude for what you have done, but because you are the woman I wish to build the rest of my life beside." Lyra's throat tightened, emotion rising too quickly for words to keep pace with it. She thought of every year spent believing herself unwanted, every quiet dismissal Thornridge had trained her to expect as her only possible future. None of that mattered now, standing here, surrounded by a pack that had chosen to see her worth from the very beginning. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I choose Emberfall, I choose you, and I choose Wick, for as long as you'll have me." The hall erupted into celebration, warmth and joy spreading through the gathered crowd in a way Lyra had never once experienced during her years within Thornridge's cold hierarchy. Wick, sensing the shift in mood, let out an excited yip from his father's shoulders, reaching one small paw toward Lyra as though eager to be included in the moment meant for the three of them alone. Ronan lifted her into his arms, laughing for what felt like the first genuine moment of unrestrained joy she had seen from him since their journey began, and Lyra allowed herself, finally, completely, to belong somewhere without fear of that belonging being taken away. Word of what had happened eventually reached every corner of the territories beyond Emberfall's borders, the story spreading from pack to pack until it became something closer to legend than simple history. A woman banished for saving a lost pup, cast out by a pack too blind to see what stood before them, who rose instead to become the guardian of a prince and the mate of an alpha king. Thornridge, meanwhile, faded slowly from relevance, its influence diminished, its name spoken more often as a cautionary tale than a source of pride. Lyra Voss, once the lowest-ranked Omega in a pack that never valued her, stood now at the very center of Emberfall's future, proof beyond any doubt that the packs who cast aside their most compassionate members would always lose far more than they ever understood in the moment of their rejection.